you can control it. Father, I thank you for every person under the sound of my voice today. I pray that you will give us listening ears to hear. Now, Father, grant me clear speech to the decision of mine. I pray, oh God, today I won't be afraid of the faces that I see today. But God, that you will let me down into the treasures of your love. Father, I pray today that you won't let my faults, my frailties, hinder the moment and disappoint the hour. But you'll stand up in me like you stood up for 40 years. And Father, I thank you now that your grace is sufficient. Now, God, may I tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Bless us all now. And if I've asked for far too little, would you do something bigger than I asked you for? In Jesus' name I pray. Child, you told me up this morning I was close. Sleep too late. Oh, he woke me right on time. Oh, he woke me up this morning. Oh, it's Jesus Christ. Would you put those hands together for our musicians? Thank God for you. Amen. I love those fellas. Thank God for them as well. Ministers and officers and deacons that are present. Ushers who serve on the door. And First Lady Pete. Amen. Each of you are our Father's children. I was glad when they said unto me, let's go to church. I want to talk to you today real briefly. I know it's holiday weekend and everybody's got barbecue.
Thank God for keeping.
And I'm pleased to get to a celebration of family, friends, and loved ones over this Labor Day weekend. I want you to turn with me to Philippians chapter 1. I want to stop there to pause and focus in particular in verses 12 to verse number 19, but for the sake of brevity of time, I'll just read verses 18 and 19. And here I am. Good to see you. I seem to be Amen. Amen. Good to see you. Always is an honor to have you in our presence. Philippians chapter 1, verse 18 and verse 19. This morning I'm reading out of the King James Version for this particular text. Philippians chapter 1, verse 18 and verse 19. What then, notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And I therein do rejoice, yea, and I will rejoice. For I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Look at somebody and say, God got it all worked out. God got it all worked out. Got it all worked out. I may not can see it. It may not feel like it. I may lay at the feet of contention. I may sleep on the bed of confusion. I may walk the path that leads to a tyrannical life, but when it's all said and done, God's got it all worked out. So let me take a few moments to deputize you as a Baptist preacher for 30 seconds and just turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor, come on, you got to use your preacher voice. Say, neighbor, I don't know none of your business, but the preacher want me to tell you, God's got it all worked out. Even when I can't figure it out, God's got it all worked out. My grandmother would say it's already done. Took me 30 years to figure out what she was talking about. It's already worked out. It's February the 24th. 1989, Boeing 747 United flight on a regular scheduled flight from Los Angeles to Honolulu, Hawaii. On board was a wife and 3 young children. A very prominent professor of Harvard. His family went before him. Early that morning, they were preparing to leave when the professor receives a call from the chancellor of the school telling him he needed to stay because there was some unfinished work, a due that needed to be handled at the campus that only he could do. This particular professor reluctantly asked his wife if he could change the vacation plans. The wife stated that those plans could not be changed, but what she would do is would take the children along with her, and then he could meet them in Hawaii at a later date. The wife went and she boarded the United flight. While en route from Los Angeles to Honolulu, Hawaii, the plane malfunctioned and crashed. There were no survivors. But the chancellor got the word that this professor's wife and 3 young daughters had perished in the plane. The chancellor goes over to the classroom to inform this senior professor that he no longer has a family. With his colleagues surrounding him that day, the chancellor begins to tell him the great tragedy that had befallen his family early that morning. This classroom gets up and rallies around this professor in prayer as he sat and he wept and he screamed out in anguish and pain of his family and the loss of his 3 young children. The professor gathered himself. It is said that he wiped his eyes, went in the hollow halls of Harvard, and he sang out loud that Presbyterian song that Horatio Spafford had penned. When peace like a river attendeth my way, and sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well with my soul. He took off a few weeks from school, and when he comes back from school, one of his students asked him, he said, Professor, he said, how do you feel today? He said, all things work together for the good of them that love the Lord and those who are called according to his purpose. The student looked at that professor and took 2 steps back and asked him, said, Professor, I know you're a godly man, but do you really believe that? And he said with a defiant voice, again, he repeated Romans 8:28. All things work together for the good. He went on to serve about 5 more years, and he himself passed away in natural causes. But before he passed, he put as an epitaph on his tombstone, he wanted it etched in Romans 8 and 28. He wanted the world to know that despite all the scars that he had in life, all things work together for the good. It holds true regardless of what hand this morning life has dealt you. And it does not matter what you came to the hill this morning facing or going through. All things work together for the good. It's very true. It's a very relevant truth that nowhere else in the New Testament will we be able to look at this more truer than our text this morning. Even when the Apostle Paul, we look at his life, if there was no other biblical personality that we could point to, we could point to Paul and be able to say, by looking at Paul's life, that truly all things work together for the good. Paul helps us to recognize that all of the difficulties that we go through in life are not a result of an accident, but rather many of the difficult challenges that we go through in life are divine appointment. And when you have a divine appointment, here it is, your alignment and your assignment will always work together. Let me say that again. Your alignment and your assignment will always work together. In fact, many times your alignment will determine your assignment. Let me say it just one more time. Your alignment will determine your assignment. It will all work together. And Paul points out that God, in his divine way of sovereignty, allows us to go through our seasons of suffering to allow us to understand that in order to get to some good things and appreciate the good things, you got to go through some bad things. All right, let me see if I can make that make sense. You would not appreciate a good man until you went through at least a bad one. You would not appreciate a good woman unless you went through at least a bad one. Come on, talk back with me if you can. And so it is what we go through then that many times determines our ability to be able to separate the good from the bad, the counterfeit from the genuine. Are you hearing me? Paul points it out, and this brings us to the first movement of our text, because this is the testing. Because when we look at this text, the first thing that I want you to notice is this particular principle that can help us deal with life when we find ourselves going through a season of suffering. It's the very first thing, and number one is we see Paul in an uncomfortable situation of adversity. And I might conclude that all of our lives will go through periods where we are in an uncomfortable situation of adversity. Watch this. Pay close attention, because Paul says in verse number 12, I hope you haven't closed your Bible. In verse number 12, Paul says he speaks of things which happen unto him. In other words, Paul reads his own resume. And when Paul reads his own resume, he acknowledges that his life of service and his life of dedication to the Savior did not grant him immunity against the things that happen in life naturally. Paul says, just because I know God, just because I serve God, just because I follow God and obey him, does not exclude my life from tragedy and does not exclude me from problems. That even though I go to church, I still got to understand I've got to deal with life when the benediction is over. It seems the more he lived, the more he labored, the more he loved the Lord, it seems as if Paul's life was constantly going haywire. And it seems as if Paul is saying through his life that maybe I am like like a lightning rod that I constantly attract calamity in my life. Unless you disagree with me, you can consider another passage of scripture, if you will, where Paul begins to chronicle all of the calamities in Paul's life when he gets to the point where he writes to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 down to verse 28. Paul speaks of his own life, and Paul says, let me tell you some of the things I've gone through just to follow God. I might conclude, my brothers and sisters, if going and following God hasn't cost you anything, you're not following him at all. Because if you're going to follow Christ, you're going to go through some things in your life. You're going to have some sleepless nights. You're going to have some pains that you won't even be able to tell the doctors where you're hurting. If you follow Christ, sometimes you're going to cry. Sometimes you're going to do good for people that won't do good for you. If you follow Christ, you're going to help people who won't help you. You're going to love people who are unlovable. If you follow Christ, you're going to have to go through some pain, some trouble, some hurt, some anxiety. You got to go through if you're going to follow Christ. I know you wanted pie in the sky. You want it easy. And I know you want me to tell you how wonderful your journey is going to be. But the real truth is, if you follow him, you got to go through. Watch this, what he says. Paul says, he speaks of his life and he says, I've labored, that frequently I've had to go to prison. Paul says, and from prison, he says, I had almost starved several times. Paul said I had 39 death experiences. I was beaten by the Jews. Paul says 3 times I was beaten with a rod and then with a club. He says once I was stoned almost to death. He says in Lystra they threw me on a pile of garbage. He says 3 times I was shipwrecked on the sea. He said by way of the journey I did not have a beast to ride, so everywhere I went I had to walk, and I almost died of starvation in Lystra. He said I was dehydrated, I was ambushed by gangsters and thugs. He said my family turned on me, my friends turned on me, my foes hated me even the more. He says I was ejected from cities, inserted in the wilderness. I was mentally tormented, physically tormented, emotionally despondent. And Paul says, but yet I remain spiritually intact. Paul said, I went through something. He said, this cost me everything. And he said, even though it cost me everything, some kind of way, even though I was in physical torment and mental torment, emotional torment, he said, God kept me together. Look at somebody and say, God will hold you together. Everything around you will be in chaos, and God will cause you to be in cosmos. Chaos is when everything is going crazy. Cosmos is when everything comes together. That's why your beautician is called a cosmetologist. Because when you go in, it's in chaos. But when you come out, it's in cosmos. You went in, it was one way. But when you came out, talk back with me if you can. It's another way. Paul says, God took my life and moved me from chaos to cosmos. Paul says, if that's not enough, Paul says, on top of all of that, I still had pastoral responsibility. Paul said, I discovered that there are things that happen to you in life that are outside of your control, regardless of how much you love the Lord and how wonderful you think you are. But when you investigate the text and you look at verses 13, 14, and verse 16, you will see a redundant phrase. Now, the redundant phrase, and I taught you in the refreshing on Tuesday night that when you see a redundant phrase over and over in the Bible, in hermeneutics, when you look at it, it's a principle. And it's a principle of when you see that phrase over and over again repeated, it means to pay close attention to it. But in verse 13 and verse 14 and verse 16, Paul, he speaks of a bond that holds him. And then he talks about this bond that holds him. And here it is. This is what he says. He says that this bond that holds me is a result of him serving Christ.
All right.
In this particular part, Paul is referring to his imprisonment at this time. When he writes the book of Philippians, Paul is in prison. And Paul was actually incarcerated in prison. And while he was there in prison, not because of something he did, but Paul was there in prison not because he did wrong, not because he messed up, not because it was something that was nefarious that happened in his life that caused him to be there. Paul was there for the cause of Christ. He was in an uncomfortable situation. Somebody say an uncomfortable situation. He was in that situation as a result of doing, here it is, the right thing. And oftentimes we who belong to God will find ourselves in an uncomfortable situation, not because we have done anything wrong, but because we, as a result of having to live a righteous life. But look, even though he was in an uncomfortable situation, the Apostle Paul said about his life, he said, not only do I have to deal with the bonds that are holding me, but he says, when you look at verse 15, he says that I have to deal with the brethren that's hurting me. Oh, yeah, I got to deal with the bonds, and that's just my lot because I follow Christ. But he said, now I got to deal with people who are hating on me. And Paul says, but some indeed, here it is, he says, some indeed preach Christ out of envy and contention, but some out of goodwill. And here it is what Paul is saying. He said, some of my brethren have decided that while I'm in my affliction, that while I'm suffering, that they were going to heap on my suffering and make me suffer even the more. I might as well tell you, my brothers and sisters, that in this life you're going to meet all kinds of people. Not just in the street, but you're going to meet all kinds of people in the church. And you need to make sure that you have a right standing with God, because if you don't, and you meet the wrong person in the church, like the person you met in the street, you'll leave the church and go back to the street and say the church is no good. Come here a minute. Because what's in the street has to come to the church so God can take the street out of the person while he's in the church, so he can clean him up in the church and then take him back to the He said, Paul said, I got them hating on me. But just because what Paul says, here's what you really need to understand. It's just because someone is with you doesn't necessarily mean they're for you. You can be with me, but not with me. We can be going in the same direction and in two directions at the same time. Somebody said it's mindset. Jesus summed it up. Let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ. You got to think like him and move like him. Watch what he says. Paul says here. He says, if you do that, you got to watch him. Paul says you got to watch him. You got to watch him. He says, it's not enough that I'm dealing with the bonds and the shackles and the handcuffs. He said, that are holding me. He said, but I got to deal with the brothers that are hurting me. He defines them in verse 16 as individuals, don't miss this, who aren't supposed to add to my affliction and my bonds, who aren't supposed to add to my injuries. Paul says, I'm already in prison, and even now, me being in prison, Paul says, I'm dealing with those individuals who ought to know Christ, but now they're heaping upon me more affliction. I hope you have come, you don't ever come to discover church pain. Because I will admit to you, my brothers and sisters, there is no pain like church pain. Things can happen and 20 years later, you can still feel the pain of some things that happen in the church. Paul says, don't become trepidated by that. Paul says, move beyond that. Make sure that you keep your spirit man intact. And he says, you cast off some stuff. But notice what Paul says, I'm in an uncomfortable situation, but I'm not feeling only the pressure of my bones, but I'm not feeling only the pressure of someone holding me, but I'm dealing with the brethren that's hurting me. And then Paul says to them that even though I'm in this uncomfortable situation, notice what he says secondly. He says, I'm dealing with it, but I'm dealing with it in a manner that where God, when it's finished, will be pleased. Paul said, I'm not going to stop working because I'm in an uncomfortable situation. Secondly, this is what he says. It's the uninterrupted service. Even though I'm in my adversity, he says, even though I'm experiencing adversity, it appears that Paul says, I'm going to stand no matter what is going on in my life. He says, I'm going to endure. I'm going to remember all of the things that God has already done for me. It stands to reason that at this moment you would appear that most people, by practical standards, imagining Paul's life, they would give up by now. But Paul seems to reach down into the deep recesses of his own personal heart and come to understand that if God did something before, he can do it again. It seems that most people, if this would have happened to most, they would have given up by reason of just the voice of just being silenced, by reason of Paul's ministry being halted to a conclusion. It would seem that Paul would have pulled over to the side and just simply said, it is not worth it. My brothers and sisters, and Satan wants us to get to the point to where we look at our lives and we experience things and we say it's just not worth it. Look at the text. He had the opposition was on every side. Paul was being at a point of retardation. His ministry was being sucked up, and he didn't feel the acceleration and exuberance of ministry anymore. And the only thing that could happen in Paul's life with the shut doors that were in his face, he says, in the middle of all of it, Paul said, instead of God shutting doors, he opened doors. Wait a minute, Paul says, you'll notice he says, my service was not interrupted. That I can keep on going no matter what. Let me give you a sermon in a sentence. God, in his divine sovereignty, has the right to move in and out of our human experiences by manipulating, maneuvering the events and the affairs of our life in such a way that'll bring us to good, but it'll give him glory. God's got a right to come into your life anytime he wants to and present something that looks bad only so he can get the glory out of your life. That's the sovereignty of God. And that he can use anything that he wants to use in your life to bring him glory. But if you don't believe that, then let me prove it. God can use, if God could use Moses' staff, if God could use a jawbone for Samson, if God could use a little boy's lunch, if God could use David's slingshot, then God can use Paul's chains to bring him glory and honor. Because God can use a negative situation in our lives and he can turn it around to be something that's positive. You don't believe it? Look at verse number 12. Verse number 12, here it is in the King James. He says, understanding this, if you don't get anything else out of this message, listen to what Paul says. He says that the things which happen to me don't have a pity party. The things that happen to me, don't cry over it. He says, the things that happen to me have rather fallen for the furtherance of the gospel. The furtherance of the gospel. That's a unique word. Paul says the furtherance of the gospel. When you look at that word, that furtherance, it's a military term. It means it's a picture word. It means to cut down things so progress can be made. Furtherance. It has to do with an army, the progression of an army. It's a word that literally means to cut away trees and bush and undergrowth. It's a picture word that means that when an army is coming on behind, the furtherance, it means to move things out of the way so the marching army can come on behind it. It's a cutting out of a path, furtherance. It means I'm removing all things. I'm trimming back things. I'm cutting down trees. I'm moving obstacles. I'm moving out things that would impede forward momentum. He says the furtherance of the gospel. Paul says in my life, when God came in my life, he said there was tragedy, but there was triumph. He said there was a pity, but he said there was power. He said when God came in my life, here's what he did. He started moving things. And even though I had problems, and even though I had tears, he said God started cutting things down and clearing out a path for my success. Can I tell you something? God has already made you successful. And here's the tragedy of most people. We seek success. Never, ever seek success. Seek what it is God has called you to do, and you will be successful. As long as you do what God told you to do, you will be successful. You never have to seek success. And Paul said, I had a whole lot going on. I could speak 7 different languages. When I was in Rome, I could speak Latin. He says when I had to go to Jerusalem, I could speak Aramaic. He said when I was in Greece, I could speak Greek. He said I know the language. But Paul says, but God has every problem under control. And even though I was speaking, it wasn't of me, it was of him. And Paul says, watch this. He says that for the furtherance of the gospel, everything I went through, God had a reason. You know, you look back over your life, my brothers and sisters, and I'm very to close. When you look back over your life, you can conclude that everything you have gone through has gotten you to the point that you are right now. The good, the bad, the sleepless nights, the hurting, the crying, people walking out of your life,